the search for peace in Ukraine, it feels like navigating a minefield, doesn't it?
It really does.
So many different perspectives, so much, urgency, and a real question of how to even chart a course forward.
Exactly.
Today, we're kind of zeroing in on a critical piece of this puzzle. President Zelensky's recent, very direct appeal to Donald Trump, and also the array of strategies being discussed to try and bring an end to this devastating war.
Yeah, and to help, get a handle on this, we've pulled together a collection of really quite informative sources.
Okay.
I think news reports keeping us up to date, some in-depth analyses from various think tanks, the full transcript of a very telling interview,
Right.
and even some on-the-ground perspectives kind of woven in.
So the goal?
Well, our goal here is really to pull out the most vital insights from all of this, to offer you, the listener, a clearer understanding of the current situation and the very real challenges we're facing.
Okay, let's dive right into this appeal from Zelensky then. It certainly sounds like a very deliberate and timely move.
It is. In a recent interview, it aired on 60 Minutes on CBS. President Zelensky made a direct, and I'd say quite pointed, invitation to Donald Trump.
To come to Ukraine.
To come to Ukraine, yes. And the timing here is key. He explicitly wants Trump to visit before any major decisions are made.
Before any negotiations really get underway.
Exactly. Before anything significant happens concerning the future of the war.
And it wasn't just a general come visit kind of invitation, was it? He had specific places in mind for Trump to see.
Precisely. Zelensky listed several very specific locations. People, civilians, warriors, hospitals, churches, children destroyed or dead.
Wow.
These are places that, in his view, really viscerally demonstrate the profound human cost, the sheer destruction.
And his reasoning.
Quite straightforward, actually. He believes that by witnessing these realities firsthand, Trump will truly grasp what Putin did, and perhaps even more importantly in Zelensky's mind, with whom you have a deal.
That phrase, with whom you have a deal, that definitely carries a lot of weight, doesn't it? Suggests a real level of suspicion about Putin.
Without a doubt, yeah. Zelensky has consistently expressed his doubts about Putin's sincerity, the reliability of any agreements, really.
Right.
And this invitation, it also comes right after that notably tense meeting at the White House back in late February 2025.
Oh, yeah, the one where Vice President Vance reportedly accused Ukraine of orchestrating propaganda tours. I remember reading about that.
That's the one. Sounded quite charged, as you say.
Yeah.
And Zelensky directly addressed those accusations in the 60 Minutes interview. He firmly denied them.
How so?
He assured Trump that any visit would be entirely authentic. Not theater, he said. And that Trump would be free to travel to any area that has come under attack.
So it sounds like Zelensky is actively trying to preempt any potential, mischaracterization or downplaying of what's happening on the ground.
Exactly. He also voiced his frustration with what he perceives as influential Russian narratives within the United States.
What kind of narratives?
Well, the idea that some individuals maybe don't fully recognize Russia as the aggressor in this conflict, that's clearly a significant concern for his government.
It was also striking to hear him talk about his personal feelings towards Putin. The language he used wasn't exactly diplomatic.
No, not at all. He stated quite unequivocally that he has 100% hatred for Putin.
100%.
Yeah, particularly after witnessing the tragic deaths of civilians, of children, including that recent devastating strike in his own hometown, Kryvyi Rih. He asked quite poignantly, how else can you see a person who came here and murdered our people, murdered children? It's raw, isn't it?
Completely understandable, given everything.
It is. A raw emotional response.
But even with that intense personal animosity, he still stresses the critical need to find a diplomatic path. That's a tough line to walk.
It truly is.
Yeah.
He makes it clear that while his hatred for Putin is profound, it doesn't diminish the urgent necessity of ending the war as swiftly as possible through negotiation.
Right. But negotiation on what terms?
Well, he's equally adamant that a just peace, in his definition, absolutely requires preserving Ukraine's sovereignty.
And getting territory back.
And eventually reclaiming all territories currently occupied by Russia. He stated very firmly, we, no matter what, will take back what is ours because we never lost it. The Russians took it from us.
Okay, so Zelensky's making this very personal, direct appeal. He's underscoring the immense human suffering, pushing back against certain narratives. Now let's maybe zoom out a bit. Look at the broader picture of U.S. policy and the various ideas being proposed for peace. It sounds like there's been quite a significant shift in the U.S. approach recently.
Yes, under the Trump administration, there does appear to be a notable shift. A shift towards prioritizing a negotiated resolution.
How so? What are we seeing?
We're seeing reports of active efforts aimed at securing a 30-day ceasefire, for instance.
Okay.
Coupled with what seems to be increasing pressure being placed on Ukraine to engage in negotiations.
Even if the terms aren't ideal for them.
Even if it potentially entails accepting less favorable terms than they might have initially hoped for, yes.
And that pressure, it seems to involve some pretty significant suggestions, like maybe dropping their NATO aspirations. Even considering ceding territory, that must be an incredibly difficult choice for Ukraine.
Yeah, it does indeed. The suggestion that Ukraine needs to be prepared to do difficult things, well, that's been widely interpreted as veiled encouragement to consider ceding territory.
Which, as you said, echoes Putin's demands from back in June 2024.
Exactly. And furthermore, the conversation around Ukraine's NATO ambitions seems to be evolving, at least within the U.S. context. Suggestions that maybe these ambitions are unrealistic in the pursuit of a peace deal right now.
It also sounds like the U.S. has been actively engaging with Russia directly. That marks a notable change in diplomatic strategy, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The sources point to what's being described as a reset of U.S.-Russia relations.
A reset? What does that involve?
Well, it includes a direct telephone conversation between Presidents Trump and Putin back in March 2025, and also bilateral discussions held in Saudi Arabia. This kind of direct engagement, it really signifies a shift in the U.S. approach to trying to facilitate a resolution.
I also read something about a temporary suspension of U.S. aid to Ukraine. That must have caused considerable alarm in Kyiv.
It certainly did. There was a reported temporary halt in U.S. military assistance and intelligence sharing.
Why? What was the reason given?
Allegedly, it was due to a perceived lack of commitment from Ukraine towards engaging in a peace process. However, this suspension was subsequently lifted. Apparently after Ukraine agreed to the U.S. proposed ceasefire and the start of talks.
So it highlights the leverage the U.S. seems to be trying to use.
Exactly, to push both sides toward the negotiating table.
And it seems that European nations aren't necessarily in lockstep with this shift in U.S. policy. Is that fair?
That's a crucial point to understand, yeah. The sources suggest a growing divergence between the U.S. and European approaches. Well, while the U.S. seems to be advocating for a relatively swift negotiated settlement, Europe is reportedly exploring alternative avenues.
Such as?
Including the concept of a coalition of the willing to potentially provide Ukraine with longer-term security guarantees. This suggests perhaps a differing vision for Ukraine's future security architecture.
Okay, so we have these big policy shifts happening at the highest levels, but what about the expert community? What kinds of peace strategies are the various think tanks proposing? It sounds like there's a wide spectrum of ideas out there.
There certainly is. We looked at several distinct approaches. First, there's the maximum pressure strategy. This comes from the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPADU. They focus on transatlantic relations.
Okay, maximum pressure. What does that entail?
It advocates for an immediate, substantial increase in military support to Ukraine. No preconditions.
The goal being?
To significantly weaken Russia's military capabilities, thereby strengthening Ukraine's negotiating position. They also call for much tougher sanctions on Russia, including secondary sanctions.
Secondary sanctions?
Yes, sanctions on entities dealing with Russia. Also, releasing frozen Russian assets to directly aid Ukraine.
And who should be at the negotiating table, according to CEPA?
Crucially, they firmly believe Ukraine and European nations must be central to any talks, and that Ukraine's NATO aspirations, that shouldn't even be on the table for a discussion with Russia.
Interesting.
They even propose a European-led international force to oversee any ceasefire. The underlying belief here is that only significant military pressure can compel Putin to genuinely negotiate.
But the risk there, presumably, is wider conflict.
Well, critics might certainly argue that, yes, it carries a heightened risk.
Okay, that's a very assertive strategy, bolstering Ukraine through strength. What's another approach being considered?
Another perspective comes from Josh Rudolph at the German Marshall Fund. He concentrates more on negotiating tactics.
Okay, tactics. How does that differ?
His recommendations revolve around engaging Putin, but from a position of strength. Based on the assessment that Putin has been weakened by the war, he emphasizes the need for the Trump administration to be prepared to walk away if Russia isn't willing to make significant concessions.
So be tough at the table.
Exactly. And a key element is coordinating sanctions with efforts to lower global oil and gas prices. Maybe leveraging the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia to put financial pressure on Russia.
Ah, the economic angle.
Yes. Plus, a robust, sustained supply of arms to Ukraine, transferring those frozen Russian assets, encouraging Europe to step up on defense and peacekeeping.
NATO.
And even offering NATO membership as a potential long-term incentive if a reasonable peace deal can't be reached. He also makes an interesting point about framing aid to Ukraine as good for American jobs, to build domestic support.
So it's a mix of pressure and incentives, with the U.S. leading the negotiation shaping. What about arguments focusing on the broader strategic and economic reasons for supporting Ukraine?
Right. The American Enterprise Institute, AEI, presents a strong case by touting economic benefits.
Economic benefits for whom?
For the U.S., primarily. They argue supporting Ukraine to achieve a decisive victory is firmly in the long-term strategic and economic interests of the United States.
How so?
Their analysis suggests a Russian victory would actually be far more dangerous and significantly more expensive for the U.S. in the long run.
More expensive?
Yeah, potentially needing a big increase in defense spending to counter a resurgent, emboldened Russia. Conversely, they believe a strong, independent Ukraine stabilizes Europe, bolsters its economy,
and lets the U.S. focus elsewhere.
And allows the U.S. to focus resources on other global challenges. Exactly. They also warn a Russian victory emboldens other authoritarian regimes.
Right.
And could lead to a significant refugee crisis in Europe. Essentially, they see a strong Ukraine as a critical bulwark for European peace and security, with tangible benefits for the U.S.
That's a compelling argument about the wider ripple effects. Are there any strategies proposing a more, maybe limited role for the U.S.?
Yes. The Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 outlines what you could call a middle road approach. Really? They acknowledge the differing views within the American conservative movement on this. They propose a more restrained level of U.S. involvement.
So less aid.
Continued military aid, yes, but stipulated that it must be fully paid for. And they suggest European allies should take primary responsibility for Ukraine's economic needs.
What's their rationale?
They emphasize a clear U.S. national security strategy focusing on American interests, avoiding direct military risks. They argue the primary U.S. focus should be the long-term threat from Communist China.
But they still see value in Ukraine's independence.
They do concur that a free and independent Ukraine ultimately aligns with U.S. strategic interests, yes.
Okay. And finally, based on all these sources, what can we sort of infer about the Trump administration's approach itself, particularly in early 2025?
Well, based on the available information from early 2025, the administration's approach seems to prioritize reaching a swift, negotiated settlement.
Even if it means concessions from Ukraine?
Even if that necessitates significant concessions from Ukraine, yes. There seems to be an underlying belief that a deal is possible with Putin, and that establishing a ceasefire is a crucial first step towards a more lasting agreement. As we discussed, they seem to view Ukraine's NATO goals as unrealistic right now.
And the difficult things phrase again.
And they believe Ukraine needs to be prepared for difficult things, which, again, likely refers to territorial adjustments. The idea of resetting U.S.-Russia relations using U.S. diplomatic influence that appears central.
Including pressure on Ukraine itself.
And there are even indications of a potential willingness to apply maximum pressure on Ukraine itself to get them to the table.
It's quite a range of strategies, isn't it? Each reflecting different priorities, different assumptions. Now, shifting gears slightly, what does the American public think about all this? It sounds like there's been a notable shift there, too.
That's correct. A Gallup poll from December 2024 shows Americans are now almost evenly divided.
Divided on what exactly?
On whether the U.S. should prioritize helping Ukraine regain territory, even if it means a longer conflict. Versus trying to get a quick end to the conflict, even if Ukraine doesn't recover all its land.
And that's a shift.
That represents a significant shift compared to earlier in the war, when a clear majority favored helping Ukraine regain territory.
And it sounds like there's a pretty significant partisan divide in those opinions.
Absolutely. Republicans overwhelmingly favor a swift end and generally express less support for continued U.S. aid.
And Democrats?
Democrats, on the other hand, largely continue to favor sustained support for Ukraine, though it's interesting.
No, it is.
Since March 2024, there's been an increase in the percentage of both Republicans and Democrats who now favor a quick resolution. So some convergence there.
What about the overall level of U.S. involvement? Do Americans generally think we're doing too much, too little, or about the right amount?
The poll suggests a slim plurality now believe the U.S. is doing too much to help Ukraine.
That view's grown over time.
It has become more prevalent, yes. Compared to earlier, fewer Americans now say the U.S. isn't doing enough. A larger proportion think the current level is about right.
And the partisan divide holds here, too.
Oh, yes. Strong partisan divide. A significant percentage of Republicans say the U.S. is overextending itself. A plurality of Democrats still feel the U.S. could do more, although that number has decreased.
Mostly independent.
Largely divided, reflecting the overall national feeling on the issue.
So public opinion seems to be evolving, maybe reflecting some war fatigue or a shift towards domestic priorities.
It seems plausible, yes.
Given all these different approaches, the shifting public mood, what are the biggest obstacles to actually achieving a lasting peace on the ground?
There are some very substantial hurdles, unfortunately. Russia has been pretty consistent with its conditions.
For sure.
Fundamentally, Ukraine accepting the current territorial realities, basically.
Yeah.
Recognizing Russian control over occupied areas and definitively abandoning any NATO aspirations.
And the EU position.
Conversely, the EU has maintained a firm stance. Sanctions on Russia won't be lifted until a complete, unconditional withdrawal of Russian forces from all internationally recognized Ukrainian territory. So, quite opposing views there.
And it sounds like there have been some, let's say, provocative actions and statements from Russia recently that haven't exactly helped de-escalation efforts.
Indeed. President Putin suggesting a UN-supervised interim government in Ukraine, that was met with strong condemnation, particularly from the U.S. and its allies.
Right.
Furthermore, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov stated Russia cannot accept the current U.S. peace proposals. Why? Because they fail to address what Russia sees as the root causes of the conflict.
And Zelensky's view on Russia's ceasefire approach.
He himself has characterized it as manipulative, suggesting it's designed either to fail or to be deliberately prolonged by imposing numerous unacceptable preconditions.
And even attempts at temporary ceasefires, like on energy infrastructure, seem to be struggling.
Yes. Despite reported efforts to get a moratorium on attacks targeting critical energy infrastructure, those attacks have unfortunately continued. Similarly, while agreements were reportedly reached in Saudi Arabia on an energy moratorium and maybe a Black Sea ceasefire, Russia then demanded the lifting of existing sanctions as a prerequisite for the maritime ceasefire to actually take effect.
So conditions keep getting added.
It clearly underscores the deep-seated mistrust, doesn't it? And the considerable difficulty in securing concrete, reliable commitments from everyone involved.
It's just a stark, sobering reminder of the ongoing human tragedy of this conflict. We absolutely cannot lose sight of the devastating impact on ordinary people.
Absolutely not. The sources consistently highlight the immense humanitarian toll. We are talking about tragic deaths, countless civilians, soldiers.
Or displacement.
The displacement of millions from their homes, their communities, widespread destruction of essential infrastructure.
Yeah.
President Zelensky's own reported figures, the continued reports of attacks like the one in his hometown. They're just grim, persistent reminders of the ongoing suffering, the urgent need to find a resolution. He himself spoke of the highest price possible being paid by Ukrainians. Lost lives, shattered futures.
So, as we bring this deep dive to a close, it really feels like President Zelensky's direct personal appeal to Donald Trump perfectly encapsulates the profound urgency, doesn't it? And the widely divergent perspectives on how to navigate forward.
It does.
So many competing national interests, deeply entrenched positions. It all continues to complicate the search for peace.
Precisely. Zelensky's appeal underscores the immense stakes involved, the intricate complexities, the diverse strategies from think tanks, the shifting public opinion in the U.S. It all illustrates the multifaceted nature of this critical global challenge.
And the obstacles remain significant.
Very significant obstacles remain in overcoming that deep-seated mistrust and achieving a negotiated settlement that can be seen as both just and crucially sustainable long-term.
This deep dive has certainly shed light on the many intricate layers here, and it leaves us, I think, with a really crucial question to ponder. Given these widely differing strategies, the profound mistrust between key actors, the immense human suffering that just continues, what do you, our listener, believe is the most viable path towards achieving a just and sustainable peace in Ukraine? And what role should the international community, including the U.S., realistically and effectively play in facilitating that? It's deeply complex, isn't it? No easy answers.
Not at all.
But it's a question that urgently demands our continued attention, our thoughtful consideration, our ongoing engagement. We really encourage you to delve deeper into these source materials, keep following this critically important global issue. Understanding these often subtle nuances is absolutely essential to being truly well-informed in today's world.